Good morning, my name is Eoin Woods. Thank you for the introduction. Welcome all, good to see so many people. Thank you for coming to the session. One thing to clear up very quickly is in the session overview, it's got a hashtag #security. I think that's because if you know me, if you've been to a talk before, you'll know I give security talks quite a lot, and I've certainly given them at GOTO. Actually, in this case, this isn't a security talk. This is entirely about DevOps, but I hope that's what you're expecting from the title and the abstract, and hopefully that won't disappoint anyone. So today, a few brief introductions. Then DevOps is of great interest at the moment. Everybody's talking about it, but everybody means a different thing by it. So what I'm going to do is explain what at Endava we mean by DevOps, because that will sort of set the scene for the rest. And then we've been working with a number of clients to implement DevOps ways of working with them. And, you know, it's quite difficult. But then we shouldn't be surprised, Agile was quite difficult too. So it's a similar mindset change. So I'll talk about some of the things that have caused problems, the sort of themes that cause problems in DevOps adoption. And then there's 3 specific practices that we found overcome at least some of those problems, and hope that will be useful insight for people. You know, I don't think they're particularly groundbreaking in a sense, but I think putting them in context and relating them to each other is useful. We've certainly found it to be useful. And then, of course, like any good talk, will have a conclusion. As we said, I normally like really interactive talks, but we've been back and forward on this quite a bit in this event and previous virtual events I've been in. And it seems in the virtual format, typing your questions into the chat channel while I'm talking, and if possible, giving a little bit of context for the question, works really well. And I'll pick those up at the end and kind of just work through them, rather than us trying to sort of change focus on the screen between us during the talk. It's sadly just one of those things, doesn't work quite as well in the virtual world. Very briefly, if I haven't met you, if I have met you before, hello again. If I haven't, it's nice to meet you. My name is Eoin Woods. I realise from 99.9% of the world's population, that's not obvious. If you leave the E off the front and pronounce the O-I-N in English, that's approximately my name. I'm lucky enough to be the CTO at Endava, which is a great firm to be in. I've been there since 2015. Before that, I was about 15 years building software products, quite big ones, in a whole range of technologies. And then for 10 years before I joined Endava, I worked for large financial firms. And that's where the idea of dev and ops coming together, first kind of jumped out at me, and we started doing that. The reason I'm not talking about security and I'm not talking about software architecture at the moment is that for about 2 years at Endava, we've had a program which we snappily titled DevOps at Endava, because about 2 years ago we realized actually we had to get much better at DevOps ways of working, and that the hard bit was not the technology. We're pretty good at that, actually, though we say it ourselves, but the hard bit's the ways of working. So we've started a whole program to work out what works for us, what can we transfer to other people, how does it all work? And we're getting to the point where we're starting to have some strong ideas as to what it looks like and some success. So we're starting to talk about it a little bit. Endava itself, if you've not come across us, we're a bit bigger than this now, particularly as we've just done an acquisition, but we're sort of 7,000-ish people. We operate in about 15 countries. We develop software for other people. So it's worth bearing that in mind. I'm always in the context of working on the problem for somebody else's business, not my own. Very different to what I've done before. Most of the clients are in North America and Western Europe, and most of our excellent software engineering centers are in Latin America and Central Europe. So this DevOps thing then, where did it come from and what do we mean? Well, it's worth very briefly recapping where it all came from. Many of you will recall, especially if you've got some grey hair like me, until relatively recently, sort of 10 years ago, software tended to be developed with an assumption it would be released to end users every 6 months, or maybe if you were quite fast moving, every 3 months. And then the agility movement came along, and thank goodness it did, because they pointed out that actually this was disastrous. And one of the most fundamental reasons that everyone hated the software we developed was having asked for something, they didn't get it for 6 months, and by that time the world had moved on. So the whole thing was about moving faster and getting software into people's hands. What that implied, of course, was that we had to be able to do change very regularly. The problem with that is that we'd actually optimized, or maybe sub-optimized, to release rather irregularly. So it was this big high ceremony thing. It wasn't highly automated. There was a lot of human activity required. It was a big deal to do a release. Do you remember those days? Well, a release and the release weekend, which struck fear into everyone's hearts, and everyone's holiday got cancelled the week after, all that kind of thing. And then But because we were changing regularly, there were a number of things about it which were just kind of annoying. We found that the bigger the piece, the harder it was to release, especially reliably, safely, and with low drama. So we started realizing maybe we should do services again, but do them right this time. So they actually were independent and not just little kind of external interfaces on this huge block of code where all the services were kind of linked at the back anyway. We actually had to make them independent. Call them microservices, but I mean, whether they're strictly microservices isn't important, but the independent releasability of them is. And then we discovered that as we released software, there were all these dependencies to it, and actually scheduling and isolating and securing lots of small pieces was quite hard. And then there was this idea that actually we could put them all in their own micro operating system called a container. So containers and services came along, and that helped a lot. So we were now able to with agility, we could organize our work into small pieces. This allowed us to release regularly. We now had some technology to allow us to release regularly. What was the remaining problem? This was all a lovely surprise for operations. They hadn't really been part of any of the discussion of this. And as they were goaled with stability, and development were goaled with rapid change, there was obviously potential for huge amount of conflict in the middle there. And so what happened then was that we introduced a whole lot of operational complexity on people. Maybe necessarily, not suggesting that was the wrong thing to do, but we didn't, to begin with, we didn't go about it the right way. And that's where DevOps came from. The reason I give the 2-minute potted history is the first box to give us context, because I think context is very important for decision making. The whole point of doing DevOps is not to have nice pipelines to automate things, to share culture. Those aren't the points, those are enablers, because we want to move faster. And we've always got to bear that in mind when we're doing any sort of change, what the ultimate goal is. As I mentioned, there are a lot of definitions of DevOps. We've had some fun with this because we're broadly friendly with many of the gurus. And if you ask the gurus, you get as many answers as there are gurus. I mean, occasionally, slightly more than there are gurus if they change their minds. 2 years ago or so, we realized that we couldn't make progress ourselves until we decided what DevOps was for us, because there was no really, really good industry standard definition that was solid, everyone agreed with, and that was detailed enough. So we said, DevOps is primarily about ways of working. It is cross-functional teams. They deliver and operate the software. They do it in a visible and measurable way. They try and create a flow of valuable stuff going to production. So they're not action-oriented, they're output-oriented. They do it in a continuous way, not literally continuous maybe, but they get as close to a continuous flow of change as they can. And very importantly, they do it in a sustainable way. And this is very important to us. In our view, anybody can have almost magical results with a decent team in a very short time horizon, so a couple of months. You can abuse your team, and you can take shortcuts everywhere technically, and you can produce good short-term results. The way I have to talk to clients about this is you can have very high velocity short-term, which then results in very low velocity over the long term, or you can have less velocity initially, but maintain that over the long term. From our perspective, the latter is much, much more desirable. And so sustainability for us is an important outcome of a DevOps type approach. You notice this doesn't actually mention automation. That's not to say automation isn't important, but for us, we've actually separated the two bits. We find this very, very useful when talking to a client who arrive and say, I need a DevOps engineer. We go, okay, what will they be doing? Building automation or helping you change the way you work? And they go, automation, of course. Right. We call that continuous delivery. We still actually have people labeled DevOps engineer, which we keep debating whether that's a good thing or not. But in our own minds, we separated the continuous delivery is the technology, the automation enabling technology. DevOps is the ways of working. But the other thing is that we haven't, although we don't specifically mention calms in our definition, it doesn't mean that we disagree with it or we have any problem with it at all. In fact, I think we've embraced it and we love it, and it's an important set of principles that we base our thinking on. So we're not suggesting that you don't need shared culture. You absolutely do. You need shared culture. Automation is important. Lean thinking is important, minimizing waste, maximizing value. Measurement's very important, so we know where we're starting, where we want to get to, and whether we're getting there. And sharing is very important, so you end up with a team that has collective ownership and knowledge. So we're very strong proponents of calms. It's just that we feel that we don't need to mention it explicitly in the definition. So this DevOps stuff sounds great. Should we just get on with it? I mean, how hard can it be? It's just ways of working after all. Well, as you know, especially, I'm sure many of you do DevOps working in your firms. I mean, when you started with lots of siloed groups and you tried to move towards unified working, there are quite a lot of difficulties with DevOps adoption. There are as many sets of difficulties as there are DevOps transformations. In fact, everyone's different because every organizational environment is slightly different. However, when we distill it down a bit and we stand back, we find that there's sort of 5 main groups of problems. You get expectation mismatch problems. The head of operations, individual operations engineers, development engineers, security engineers, the CISO, head of IT, software engineering VP, they've all got slightly different, maybe radically different, they've all got different expectations of what this means, from we're kind of doing it already, it's just a thing development getting on with, that'll all be fine, through to everything's going to change, my life is going to be radically different and much, much better, and we're going to change every working practice we've got, and everything in between. You've also got the problem with culture, partly related to the other point of silos. The silos go slightly deeper than culture, but you will have, well, I'm prejudging, but in most organizations I've seen, you've got different cultures and different groups, and that's not all that surprising, because the groups in our current organizations tend to be organized around specialization, and those specializations tend to build culture. So a lot of people start with the next problem, which is a tools focus. The classic DevOps transformation we've seen, which has failed, is the organization decides they want to go DevOps, they talk to some vendors sell them some reassuringly expensive tooling on an enterprise license, they set up a DevOps center of excellence, which is actually a tools deployment and consultancy group, and then they're quite surprised that nothing seems to change. Because after all, they were promised by the tools vendors that these are DevOps tools, but actually it wasn't a tools problem to begin with. Yes, they needed to improve their automation, but it wasn't really a tools problem because they were working in silos. And now they've put in a tool and they're still working in silos. And there's still lots of handoffs. And still it's not quite clear who's accountable for the end-to-end delivery of value. And those silos are difficult to dismantle. Finally, the organizational environment. Different organizations have different problems implementing DevOps. Some of them have a regulatory problem. Some have a market and positioning problem, that they got very, very thin margins and it's very hard to change anything. Some have very conservative norms in their industry. Some have extremely embedded long-term sort of year-by-year planning cycles, which they can't change. It's different in different places, but the organizational environment, we have also noticed, can also cause problems with not only DevOps, of course, but also agile working, which I'm sure you've also met. So when we've tried to help people with DevOps working, there's 3 practices that we've noticed that seem to be useful. Agile working, which is sort of obvious, except that how many people here have seen agile working that's not very agile? It's agile working that's actually agile, as opposed to agile working that's following the ceremonies. Pipelines, everyone's got a pipeline, but as I'll talk about in a minute, it's a slightly deeper thing, a pipeline, than just a clever bit of automation. The automation is useful, that's enabling, but it's more than that. Pipelines are actually really interesting collaboration points. And finally, enabler teams, and this is an organizational construct where we sort of inject, if you like, some expertise and evangelization, enthusiasm into an organization to help point the direction before then dissolving into the organization or disappearing and leaving the organization to be self-sufficient. So agile working, we're all very familiar with it. I know, I'm not trying to tell you what agile working is. And this, as any agile coach would point out to me, is not necessarily agile. This is in fact incremental delivery. And it's perfectly true, it's iterative. But the key thing about this picture is I'm just reminding us all, the point of agile working is that we get production deployable code on a regular basis. We don't, and we launch it. We don't end up with something that is released every 6 months. That's kind of important because for DevOps to be meaningful, but also for DevOps really to be possible in a meaningful sense, in a kind of real sense, it actually needs a regular, sustainable, so not peaky, but sustainable and predictable flow of changes that are worth making. If we haven't got that flow, the DevOps thing just doesn't matter so much. And adopting DevOps is relatively painful. maybe good pain, but relatively painful. So we need to make sure we've got this there, and that's going to require us to have an empowered, decisive, intelligent, cooperative product owner. How many people have a problem with the product owners? It's the most common problem we see in agile working. You'll need a team who feel empowered, they're cross-functional, they can develop pieces of software, themselves. High quality, maintain, prioritize backlog, which is not just the product owner's problem. This is also the team being self-critical and constructively critical of the backlog that they're working with. And you need consistent and sufficient software quality to produce that sustainability. Now, software quality is very contextual. What you require for, a missile control system, what they call quality, and what a payment system calls quality, and what a fast-moving e-commerce storefront calls quality. They're all actually quite different. The important thing is in the environment you're working in, you need consistent and sufficient quality to achieve sustainability. The second practice is pipelines. Pipelines are interesting because everyone's got one, but often we don't think very deeply about why we've got one. Former colleague of mine, Ed Butler, who's been really quite foundational in lots of the DevOps work we've done, he was the one that actually called this out and made it kind of very explicit in Endava. And as he pointed out, every stage in the pipeline, it goes from commit to production, that's the point of it. But every stage in the pipeline needs to be building stability, or quality, you might call it, into the software that you're creating. And we quite often find people who are a bit unclear as to what's in their pipeline, why it's there. And there's great debates about the order of things in the pipeline. And we find actually this is an organizing principle actually helps quite a bit. Is what's in your pipeline at every stage adding stability or quality to the software that's going down it? Because after all, when a developer checks stuff in and it's, he's doing trunk-based development, it goes onto trunk, we haven't got massive confidence in it, have we? I mean, they've built it. They've done lots of unit testing. They have run other people's tests on it, but we wouldn't probably want to deploy it right now. But what we need to do at the end of the pipeline is to go, absolutely, we want to deploy this now. We know it's valuable because of the agile working, and now we have high confidence that this will go into production and not cause us a huge problem. And the confidence is important because we're asking quite a lot from stakeholders, some of them not very technical, to trust us to do this automated deployment with very little human intervention. But if you're a traditional audit and compliance person, for example, in a relatively regulated industry, or even a business user who has been around for some years, that may not be something you're very comfortable with. And so the pipeline is how we make that visible to them. So I always characterize pipelines as being a single automated path from commit to production. That is not something we use just when it suits us. It's the way to production for everything from a micro fix up to an entire release. And it brings us reliability, repeatability, consistency, and efficiency. All great things, kind of independent of DevOps. I mean, it's good to have those things whether you want to adopt DevOps working or not. Who doesn't want repeatability, consistency, efficiency, and reliability? So they're all great enablers, but they're not really DevOps specific. The interesting thing about DevOps is that the pipeline becomes a bit of a collaboration point. I was a bit surprised actually when I realized this in the last couple of years, maybe just before. But actually I shouldn't have been, because I then realized I'd seen an example of this some years ago, so 5-6 years ago, when I was at a big investment bank. We did a lot of encouraging of operations-oriented people and dev-oriented people to pair on problems, on improvements, on understanding the system in production. What we noticed, though, was when they paired, it tended to be like an ops person doing stuff and a dev person looking on in a sort of slightly engaged, interested way, an interested observer, but not being very engaged. And sometimes it worked the other way. There was a dev person who wanted to do something or understand something, and there was an ops type person, again, not disinterested, I mean, interested in wanting to contribute, but not being very involved. And then, not particularly looking to solve this problem, we bought a tool called AppDynamics. I'm not particularly endorsing AppDynamics, so it worked for us. But what was interesting about it was this was suddenly a tool that was as useful to developers as it was to operations, and they both used it. Slightly different ways, but they both used it through the same interface. And what we noticed now is as people paired, there was much more interaction between them when they were using AppDynamics, because they both sort of felt that this was something that they had a stake in, they understood, they could use, and there was much more of that very positive, trying to pull the keyboard away type interaction where two people are trying to really collaborate with each other. And it suddenly came to me when we realized this about pipelines, it's the same thing. The shared tool makes the ops person, the security person, the dev person, the tester, they've all got an interest in the pipeline. Yes, I mean, they're more interested in different bits, but with the collective ownership DevOps is bringing, this is a great collaboration point for them all to think, so from commit to production, this is like our thing. I mean, I know a lot more about this bit, but I'm quite interested in that bit because it's feeding me. So they kind of view it as a natural collaboration point. So not just a technical benefit. It's also a visible manifestation of the path to production. You know, in development and, I mean, obviously in the whole technical environment, we talk earlier about this path to production. It's highly automated. It's like a factory or a machine or a capital one called a clean room. All these terms, these don't mean a lot to non-technical stakeholders, such as some product owners, business people, compliance, audit, business operations, business change. They just kind of look at us and go, okay, that's more kind of software stuff, is it? And we go, yeah, well, but it's like magical software stuff. It takes the stuff to production. They go, yeah, this is meaning nothing. Whatever. I mean, as long as it's working, I'll just let you do it. That's hardly building confidence. Whereas if we expose our pipeline, as so many of us do, on the big screens, you can show them the stages, you can generate metrics off the stages, you can show them inputs and outputs. Suddenly they're going, oh, I get it. Oh, yeah. So, yes, so that's going to check that this is true, and that's going to check this is true. Yes, I feel much better now. I kind of get what you guys do between doing your magic typey stuff and me having software. As we've said, increases confidence stage by stage. And sometimes part of that is allowing manual checkpoints into the pipeline, but the important point being it's a manual checkpoint, it's not a manual do stuff point. We don't want to have manual stages in the pipeline, but especially early in the evolution when people are building their confidence, it's not unreasonable to allow the pipeline to stop and say, is this okay? Click here to continue. And for people to go, let me just take a look at what you've done. Yeah, that's fine. I mean, I know it introduces latency, but in terms of building confidence, and sometimes for regulatory reasons, we shouldn't be against that, as long as it's not an excuse for someone to suddenly jump in and have to do a lot of manual work. That's not a good thing. And then our third practice is enable a team. So we've got agile working, we've got a flow of change coming into production. We've got pipelines, ensuring that flow is reliable, it's building confidence, and it's making what we're doing visible. Enabler teams are kind of cross-cutting this kind of thing because DevOps implementation, as I've mentioned, is not trivial. It's quite a difficult process. And it's hardly ever a technology problem, we've noticed. The technology we can fix, we're engineers, we're pretty good at the technology. And to be fair, a lot of what we call continuous delivery technology, you might call it DevOps technology, it's really pretty good. It's quite modern and it's quite robust. But there is a lot to learn. There's a lot of culture change, and there's a lot of behavior you want to encourage in people. And we found the enabler team is one way you can help with this. An enabler team is not a set of coaches floating around, moving people's post-it notes. That's not what they do. They are a real development team. They're doers, and they're a peer team in the overall team, which is quite hard to draw to have them linked. We have put it above, but that looks as if they're directing the teams. They're not. So now we put it below to show they're serving the teams. They're supporting the teams. The difference between them and a normal Scrum team is that although they're doers, they're also experts in the ways of working that we want to achieve and the technologies that we're introducing. So as well as doing, they have a responsibility to develop culture by the way they work, just by example, to bring and transfer technical knowledge, perhaps of new pipelines, new deployment approaches, new security testing approaches. And also perhaps, not always, but perhaps build useful shared things. You may well need, for example, your first pipeline, there may not be a huge amount of technical confidence in the team that they know what to do. So perhaps an enabler team could build the first pipeline before it becomes that commons that everybody feels ownership of. There's quite a lot of things you could use an enabler team for, but three broad classes we've noticed are nurturing teams. They go in and do their work, but as a side effect, they've always got in the back of their minds, I'm trying to make sure all the other teams are working the way we are. So they're constantly looking for problems, confusions. They're someone people can go to ask for help. They're an exemplar team. Other teams can look into and say, oh, that's how you make that work. Oh, that's how you do corporate security. Yeah, I hadn't really thought of doing that. They're people who can jump into the other Scrum teams if needed, maybe just for a couple of days, to say, you seem to be really hurting when you're producing integration tests. I think there's probably a technical problem. Let me come and help you. So they're nurturing other teams' behavior and capability. Building teams. they're the ones that can build useful stuff. The important thing is you don't want them to be another silo. So they either build, dissolve, and then everyone adopts the thing, or they aggressively rotate people from the other Scrum teams through them. In that case, you get evangelists who understand the shared thing and go back and evangelize it, and you share the knowledge. And you also, because of the rotation, you get somebody from this enabler team put into one of the Scrum teams for a period, and that's another evangelist who's there to make things better. And finally, you can also get short-term fixing teams. We see these particularly in testing, but not necessarily testing. Maybe the other thing that is sometimes wrecked is the deployment. People have been playing with deployment tools for several years, and it's a right old mess. And there's possibly a nurturing team there going, this clearly needs to be fixed, but we've got real work to do, and we're trying to help these guys. We just need someone to come in and solve this problem for us. So you either extend it a bit, or you drop in another short-term team who comes in. Again, they don't fix it by themselves, own it, and then vanish. They fix it continually thinking, how do I make sure that I'm fixing it with the other people? I'm fixing it so that they don't do this again, and that they know how to avoid this problem in the future. So again, that they're enabling, they're not just doing. The key point being, enabler teams typically dissolve. As the program lifetime goes on, from having a team, you end up with people who've probably dispersed into the Scrum teams, or maybe they've sort of vanished off somewhere else, leaving their knowledge behind them. But the key thing is you do not want a little sort of super team in the middle that everyone says it's their problem, they do the DevOps. And you also don't want some situation where they're seen as, they own all of that sort of magic DevOps technology. That's a bad outcome. And if it's heading that way, you need to kind of dissolve the enabler team quickly. But actually, that's not been seen as a huge problem. People get that point. So in conclusion, the DevOps era is here. It's worth recapping the fact that the reason it's here isn't to get DevOps working together for its own sake. It's here so we can move faster, so we can support agility. Agility and DevOps are like these interlocked twins. Agility makes DevOps relevant. DevOps enables agility to be impactful. And for us, DevOps is the ways of working. This is the Endava view. It's cross-functional teams. They deliver and operate. They create a flow of value, and they do it in a continuous and also sustainable, very important for us, a sustainable way. The adoption is complex, and in every environment it's different, but it's worth thinking about expectations. Where's the culture mismatch? What sort of organizational environment are we in? Where are the silos that we're going to have to overcome? And are we starting with a tools focus? Because that's very unlikely to address those other challenges, which are not primarily technical challenges, although the tools are definitely valuable. I'm not suggesting they're not. And the practices that we've found to be working are, get your agile working first. Without that flow of value, it's either meaningless or very difficult to do the DevOps transformation. Pipelines are surprising artifacts. They don't just make things technically better, they actually help people to work in new ways, so make things culturally better as well. And they've also got this other side effect that isn't immediately obvious. You can use them as the visualization and confidence building mechanism for the less technical stakeholders to start trusting that this new automated low touch world of changes flow into production is actually something they can believe in. And finally, enabler teams are there to inject culture, transfer knowledge, build and transfer useful things to give existing teams who, after all, are busy. They don't get sent off for 3 months on a retreat to learn to do DevOps. They tend to have to do it alongside their daily work. You give them the boost, the motivation, the evangelism, sometimes the hands-on technical help to support them and make them successful as they go through the transition. The important thing being, if you have an enabler team, they need to be dissolved or rotated on a very regular basis. Otherwise, they just become another silo. For your DevOps journey, we having tried this a number of times, we suggest start with the people who care in your organization. Some will love the idea, some will hate the idea, and some won't care very much. Work out the 3 groups. And work out what your environment needs and what the blockers and risks in your environment are. And from that, you will quickly work out your DevOps adoption challenges. And that allows you to work out which adoption practices and also patterns. That's a different presentation. We've got a number of adoption patterns to help people, but which practices and patterns are likely to make you successful. And although we don't talk about it all the time, we don't keep drawing people's attention back to them explicitly, let's keep on bearing in mind that there are some important underlying principles that are important to be living and breathing if we're really kind of achieving DevOps work. Thank you.